The sound of a gunshot echoing through the Sunday morning stillness brought Declan Irwin riding into Centralia, Washington, with his hand already on his revolver. Though he found nothing but a young boy celebrating his first successful hunt with his father near the edge of town. Declan relaxed his grip and continued down the dusty main street, noting the white church steeple rising above the modest buildings of this timber town, nestled in the Washington Territory. It was late spring in 1884, and the Pacific Northwest bloomed with wildflowers and possibility, though Declan had learned long ago not to expect much from any town he drifted through. He had been wandering for nearly 6 years now, ever since his family's ranch in Texas burned to the ground during a lightning storm that took his father and younger brother with it. His mother had died of heartbreak 6 months later, and Declan found he could not bear to rebuild on land soaked with so much loss. So he rode, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough for roots to grow deep. He was 26 now, lean and weathered beyond his years, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds over the prairie. Centralia was a timber town, bustling with loggers and mill workers, the air perpetually scented with fresh-cut pine and cedar. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and that pristine white church that seemed almost defiant in its cleanliness among the rough-hewn surroundings. Declan guided his horse toward the boarding house, figuring he would rest a few days before moving on. His saddlebags held just enough money for a week's lodging and meals if he was careful. The boarding house proprietor was a weathered woman named Mrs. Calloway, who looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every type of drifter the West produced. "We do not tolerate drinking, fighting, or loose women," she announced before he had even dismounted. "Yes, madam," Declan said, touching the brim of his hat. "I am just looking for an honest bed and perhaps work if any is available." Her expression softened marginally. "Mill is always hiring. Church supper is Wednesday nights, free for anyone who attends service. Reverend Vaughn sees to it that nobody goes hungry in this town if they are willing to sit through Scripture." Declan nodded, handed her coins for 3 nights, and took his few possessions to a small room on the second floor. The bed was narrow but clean, the window overlooked the street, and for a moment he allowed himself to simply sit in the silence. 6 years of movement had left him tired in ways that sleep never quite fixed. That evening he walked to the saloon, not for whiskey but for information about work. The bartender confirmed that the mill hired regularly, but warned that the work was dangerous and the hours long. Declan had done worse. He nursed a single beer and listened to the conversations flowing around him, learning the rhythms of this town as he had learned dozens of others. "Preacher's got his niece staying with him now," one logger said to another. "Came all the way from Boston after her parents died. Pretty little thing, but she looks at us like we are all headed straight to perdition." "Reverend Vaughn probably told her we are," his companion laughed. "Man gives a powerful sermon on sin. I will give him that." Declan paid little attention to talk of preachers or their nieces. He had found that towns like this came with their own strict social boundaries, and a drifter was wise to keep to his own kind. The next morning he presented himself at the lumber mill just after dawn and was hired on the spot. The foreman, a barrel-chested man named Gunderson, put him to work immediately hauling lumber from the saws to the drying racks. The work was indeed hard, but Declan welcomed the burn in his muscles, the way exhaustion crowded out thought. He worked through the day barely speaking to the other men, and by evening he was too tired for anything but a simple meal and sleep. This became his pattern for the first few days, a routine as familiar as breathing. On Wednesday evening, hungry and low on funds until his first wages, Declan found himself walking toward the white church as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. He told himself it was only practical, that free food was nothing to be proud about but nothing to refuse either. Other men from the mill were heading the same direction, cleaned up as best they could manage, their work-roughened hands scrubbed nearly raw. The church was smaller inside than it appeared from without, with simple wooden pews and windows that let in the evening light. A woman was setting out plates and utensils on long tables at the back of the room, and Declan's breath caught unexpectedly in his chest. She was not what the logger's words had led him to expect. Pretty, yes, but that word was insufficient for the vision she made in the golden light streaming through the windows. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that emphasized her slender waist, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun that nonetheless allowed soft tendrils to frame her face. But it was her expression that struck him most, a look of such intense focus and determination as she arranged the simple meal, as if the proper placement of each fork mattered deeply. "That is Miss Beatrice Vaughn," a voice said beside him, and Declan turned to find a younger mill worker whose name he thought was Thomas. "The preacher's niece. Been here about 2 months now. She helps with the church work." Declan nodded, not trusting his voice, annoyed at himself for the reaction. He had seen beautiful women before and had even courted a few in his younger days. This was different somehow, though he could not articulate why. Reverend Vaughn turned out to be a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and a voice that carried without shouting. He welcomed everyone warmly, said a blessing over the simple meal of stew and bread, and invited them all to eat their fill. Declan found himself in line, moving slowly forward, trying not to obviously watch the young woman as she ladled stew into bowls with careful precision. When he reached the front of the line, she looked up at him with eyes the color of summer sage, and he saw surprise flicker across her features before she schooled them back to polite welcome. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of education and Eastern refinement. "Are you new to Centralia?" "Yes, madam, Declan Irwin." He held his bowl steady as she filled it with generous portions. "I have been working at the mill." "Welcome to our congregation, Mr. Irwin. I am Beatrice Vaughn." She handed him a thick slice of bread. "I hope you will find our community welcoming." There was something in her eyes that suggested she doubted this, as if she herself had not quite found welcome here despite her uncle's position. Before he could respond, the man behind him cleared his throat impatiently, and Declan moved on, taking a seat at the end of one of the long tables. The stew was simple but well made, rich with vegetables and chunks of venison. Around him men ate and talked, the conversation ranging from work at the mill to the quality of the fishing in the nearby Skookumchuck River. Declan ate in silence, aware that his eyes kept drifting to where Beatrice moved among the tables, refilling water pitchers and clearing empty bowls with graceful efficiency. Reverend Vaughn eventually stood and delivered a brief sermon about charity and community, about how every person regardless of station deserved dignity and care. It was a good sermon, delivered without the fire and brimstone Declan had expected, and he found himself listening with genuine interest. When the evening concluded, the Reverend stood at the door shaking hands and learning names, his niece beside him with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. When Declan approached, the Reverend gripped his hand firmly. "Mr. Irwin, Thomas tells me you are one of the hardest workers at the mill. We need good men like you in Centralia." "Thank you, Reverend. The meal was much appreciated." Declan turned slightly to nod at Beatrice. "Miss Vaughn, the stew was excellent." A real smile flickered across her face then, brief but genuine, and it transformed her completely. "Thank you. It was my mother's recipe." There was grief in those words, recent and raw, and Declan recognized it as the mirror of his own. "I am sorry for your loss," he said quietly, the words inadequate but sincere. Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes. "And I for yours, whatever it may be." A man does not learn to recognize grief so readily without carrying his own. The Reverend looked between them with interest, but said nothing, turning to greet the next person in line. Declan touched his hat brim and stepped out into the cool evening, feeling unsettled in a way he could not quite name. Over the following weeks, Declan fell into a routine that revolved around work, rest, and Wednesday evening church suppers. He told himself he attended for the food and fellowship, but he knew he was lying to himself. He went to see Beatrice, to exchange a few words with her as she served the meal, to watch the way lamplight played across her features during her uncle's sermons. He learned details about her in fragments, pieced together from overhead conversations and brief exchanges. She was 23, had been raised in Boston where her father worked as a banker, had received an excellent education unusual for a woman. Her parents had died in a fire that swept through their building last winter, and Reverend Vaughn was her only living relative. She had arrived in Centralia in late March, a city woman thrust into a rough frontier town, trying to find her place among people who spoke a different language and lived by different rules. She taught at the small school during the day, Declan discovered, the only teacher for children ranging from 6 to 14. He sometimes saw her walking to the schoolhouse in the morning, always carrying a leather satchel heavy with books, her posture straight despite the weight. She never looked his way, though he wondered if she noticed him watching from where he stood waiting for the mill to open. It was mid-June, when their paths truly crossed beyond the brief exchanges at church suppers. Declan had been in Centralia nearly a month, and he found his usual restlessness had not yet manifested. He told himself it was because the work was steady and the pay fair, but late at night when he could not sleep, he admitted to himself that it had everything to do with a certain young woman with sage-colored eyes. He was walking back from the mill one afternoon, tired and covered in sawdust, when he heard raised voices from the alley beside the general store. He recognized trouble by instinct and moved quickly toward the sound, hand falling to the knife at his belt. He had sold his revolver 2 towns back when funds ran low, but he still knew how to handle himself in a fight. 3 young loggers had cornered someone against the alley wall, their postures aggressive. As Declan rounded the corner, he saw with a spike of fury that they had trapped Beatrice, who clutched her satchel to her chest like a shield. "Come on now, schoolteacher," one of them was saying, his words slurred with afternoon drinking. "Just one kiss. You are too pretty to be so cold." "Leave me alone," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "My uncle will hear about this." "Your uncle is not here," another leered, reaching for her. "But I am," Declan said, his voice cutting through their drunken bravado like a blade. 3 heads turned toward him, and he saw the moment they registered his presence, the way their drunken confidence wavered. He was not the biggest man, but 6 years of drifting had taught him how to project danger when needed. "The lady asked you to leave her alone." The largest of the 3, a red-haired man named Callahan who Declan recognized from the mill, sneered. "This is not your business, drifter. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Declan stepped further into the alley, positioning himself between Beatrice and the 3 men. "I am making it my business. You have 3 seconds to walk away before this gets unpleasant." Callahan was drunk enough to be stupid. He swung at Declan with a wild haymaker that was easy to dodge. Declan drove his fist into the bigger man's stomach, folding him in half, then shoved him back into his companions. They all went down in a tangle of limbs, cursing. "Next time I will not be so gentle," Declan said quietly. "Now get out of here." They scrambled to their feet and retreated, Callahan shooting venomous looks over his shoulder. Declan watched until they disappeared around the corner, then turned to Beatrice. She was pressed against the wall, her face pale, knuckles white where she gripped her satchel. "Are you hurt?" he asked, keeping his distance, not wanting to frighten her further. She shook her head, then seemed to realize she was trembling and took a deep breath, visibly gathering herself. "No, thank you, Mr. Irwin, they were not. I mean, I do not think they would have actually." She trailed off, perhaps realizing that she did not know what they would have done, that Declan's arrival had prevented finding out. "May I walk you home?" Declan offered. "Just to be certain." She hesitated, and he saw her weighing propriety against practical safety. Practical safety won. "Yes, thank you." They walked in silence for a few minutes, Beatrice's breathing gradually returning to normal. The Reverend's house was a neat cottage behind the church, painted white with green shutters and a small garden out front. When they reached the gate, she finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" The question surprised him. "Because you needed help. Many men in this town would have walked past. Some would have." She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "I am trying to understand why you intervened. You barely know me." Declan met her eyes and found himself answering with more honesty than he intended. "I know you lost your parents recently and came here alone. I know you work hard to help your uncle and teach children who probably do not always appreciate it. I know you try to make community for men like me who have little enough of it. That is enough to know that you deserve better than to be harassed in an alley." Something flickered in her expression, surprise and something else he could not quite read. "You noticed all that from Wednesday suppers." "I am good at noticing things." She studied him for a long moment, and he resisted the urge to look away from that penetrating gaze. "Yes," she said finally. "I believe you are. Thank you again, Mr. Irwin, truly." "Declan," he said. "You can call me Declan." A small smile touched her lips. "Only if you call me Beatrice." "Beatrice," he repeated, and liked the way her name felt in his mouth. "I should go inside. My uncle will be preparing for this evening's counseling sessions." She paused at the gate. "Will you be at supper this Wednesday? I had planned on it." "Good." She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked up the path to the cottage, her posture straight and composed once more. Declan watched until she disappeared inside, then made his way back to the boarding house, his mind whirling with thoughts he had no business entertaining. The confrontation with Callahan had consequences. The next day at the mill, the foreman pulled Declan aside. "Heard you had trouble with some of the boys yesterday. They were bothering a woman. I encouraged them to stop." Gunderson's expression was unreadable. "The woman being the preacher's niece." "That is correct." The foreman was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Callahan is claiming you started it, says you came at them unprovoked." Anger flared in Declan's chest, but he kept his voice level. "That is a lie. They had her cornered." She was frightened. "I believe you," Gunderson said, surprising him. "Callahan is a good worker but a mean drunk, and this is not the first complaint about him bothering women in town. But he comes from a family that has been in Centralia since it was founded, and you are a drifter who has been here a month. You understand the politics." "Yes, sir. Keep your head down and do your work. I will handle Callahan." Gunderson clapped him on the shoulder. "For what it is worth, you did the right thing." Declan returned to work, aware of hostile stares from Callahan and his friends. He ignored them, focusing on the physical labor, the familiar burn in his muscles. He had made enemies before and survived. What troubled him more was the realization that he cared what happened. That Centralia was starting to feel less like a temporary stop, and more like a place he might want to stay. That thought should have sent him running. Instead, Wednesday found him walking to church supper with something uncomfortably close to anticipation. Beatrice was at her usual station, serving food with her characteristic precision. When he reached the front of the line, she looked up and smiled, a real smile that lit her entire face. "Good evening, Declan." The use of his first name, the warmth in her voice, sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Good evening, Beatrice. I heard there was trouble at the mill." Concern shadowed her eyes. "Because of what happened?" "Nothing I could not handle. I spoke with my uncle. He went to Callahan's father. It will not happen again, the harassment at the mill." Declan was surprised by how much effort that must have taken, how she had advocated for him despite her precarious social position. "Thank you. You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did. You helped me." "It is only right that I help you." She ladled stew into his bowl, added extra bread. "Also, I wanted to." Their eyes met and held, and Declan felt the ground shift beneath his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the timber framing of the church floor. Around them, the noise of the gathering faded to insignificance. There was only her sage-green eyes, the slight flush in her cheeks, the way her lips parted slightly as if she was about to say something more. "Beatrice, stop monopolizing the new fellow." Reverend Vaughn's voice cut through the moment, warm with humor. "Others are waiting to eat." The spell broke. Beatrice blinked and turned to the next person in line, but not before Declan saw his own confused wonder reflected in her expression. He moved to his usual seat, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. After the meal and sermon, as people were leaving, Reverend Vaughn approached Declan. "Mr. Irwin, might I have a word?" Declan's stomach tightened, certain he was about to be warned away from the Reverend's niece. "Of course." But the Reverend surprised him. "I wanted to thank you properly for helping Beatrice. She told me what happened, what those men were doing. As her uncle and her guardian, I am in your debt." "No debt, Reverend. Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps, but you were the one who was there, who acted. That matters." Vaughn studied him with sharp eyes. "You have been in Centralia a month now. Do you plan to stay, or are you like most drifters, here until the wanderlust takes you again?" It was a fair question, one Declan had been avoiding asking himself. "I have not decided. May I offer some unsolicited advice from an old man who has seen much of human nature?" Declan nodded, bracing himself. Running from grief never heals it. It only spreads it thinner, makes it cover more ground. Eventually you have to stop and face what you have lost. Let yourself mourn properly before you can build anything new. Vaughn's expression was kind but penetrating. "I do not know what you lost, son, but I recognize a man trying to outrun his past." The words struck closer to home than Declan wanted to admit. And if stopping hurts worse than moving, it does at first. But then it starts to heal, and healing only happens when you are still enough to let it. The Reverend paused. "Centralia is a good town. We could use a man like you, someone who works hard and stands up for what is right. Think about it." Reverend Vaughn walked away then, leaving Declan standing in the empty church, surrounded by the lingering sense of simple food and candle wax, contemplating possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider in 6 long years. Over the following weeks, Declan found his path crossing with Beatrice's more frequently. Whether by design or chance, he was never quite sure, but he welcomed it regardless. She would be leaving the schoolhouse as he passed on his way to the boarding house, and they would walk together for a few blocks, conversation flowing more easily with each encounter. He learned that she loved poetry, particularly Emerson and Whitman, that she had dreams of opening a proper school with multiple teachers and grade levels. She spoke of Boston sometimes, her voice tinged with nostalgia for the cultural richness she had left behind, but also with frustration at the rigid social expectations that had governed every aspect of her life there. "Here I can breathe," she told him one evening as they walked past the mill, closed now for the night. In Boston, every action was measured against propriety, every word weighed for its social implications. It was suffocating, though I did not realize it until I left. Here, I am simply the schoolteacher, the preacher's niece. No one cares that my dress is 2 years old or that I walk unescorted sometimes. "You are not unescorted now," Declan pointed out. She looked at him, amusement dancing in her eyes. "No, I suppose I am not." "Does that bother you, being seen with me? Some of the mill workers give you strange looks when we pass. Let them look. You are very certain about that." "I am certain about very few things, but walking with you is one of them." The words came out more intensely than he intended, laden with feeling he was not quite ready to name. Beatrice stopped walking, turning to face him fully. They were standing at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to forest, the June evening settling into that long Pacific Northwest twilight that seemed to stretch forever. "Declan," she said softly, "what are we doing?" It was a fair question, one he had been avoiding. "I do not know," he admitted. "I only know that I look forward to Wednesdays to these walks. I know that I think about you when I should be thinking about work. I know that for the first time in 6 years, I am not planning which town I will drift to next." Her eyes widened slightly. "Why not?" "Because leaving would mean not seeing you again, and I find that idea increasingly unbearable." Beatrice drew in a sharp breath. "I should not be happy to hear that. I should tell you that we barely know each other, that you are a drifter with no prospects, that my uncle would have concerns. I should be practical, but," he hardly dared to breathe, "but I am happy to hear it, impractically, foolishly happy." She laughed, the sound edged with disbelief. "I came to Centralia to escape the ruins of my old life, and I told myself I would be sensible, that I would focus on teaching and helping my uncle. I was not supposed to develop feelings for a wandering cowboy who rides into town covered in trail dust and proceeds to turn my careful plans upside down." "I am sorry," Declan said, though he was not sorry at all. "No, you are not." But she was smiling when she said it. "And neither am I, which is perhaps the most surprising part of all this." They stood there in the fading light, the space between them charged with possibility and the weight of what they were acknowledging. Declan wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that shook him, but he held himself still. This moment was too important to rush, too fragile to risk on his own desire. "May I court you properly?" he asked instead. "With your uncle's permission, doing things the right way." "I would like that very much," Beatrice said, and the joy in her voice was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Asking Reverend Vaughn for permission to court his niece was one of the most nerve-wracking things Declan had ever done, and he had once faced down 3 cattle rustlers alone. He presented himself at the cottage on a Saturday afternoon, scrubbed clean and wearing his best shirt, which was not saying much. The Reverend received him in his study, a small room lined with books and smelling of pipe tobacco. "Mr. Irwin," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I suspect I know why you are here." "Yes, sir. I would like your permission to court Miss Vaughn." Vaughn steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about yourself, Declan, where you come from, what you have been running from." So Declan told him, the words coming easier than he expected. He spoke of the ranch in Texas, the fire that took his father and brother, his mother's death. He spoke of 6 years of drifting, of hollow towns and empty work, of trying to outrun grief that followed him like a shadow. And he spoke of arriving in Centralia, of Beatrice, of feeling for the first time since the fire that he might have found a place worth staying for, When he finished, Vaughn was silent for a long moment. "That is a heavy burden to carry alone," he said finally. "Have you considered that in courting my niece, you might be seeking to fill the void your family left, rather than building something genuine?" The question was fair, and Declan had asked it of himself. "I considered it," he admitted. "But what I feel for Beatrice is not about replacing what I lost. It is about finding something I did not know I could have. Hope, maybe. A future that does not just stretch emptily ahead. And if the wanderlust takes you again, if you wake one morning and feel the need to move on, then I will fight it because she is worth fighting for, worth settling down for." The truth of the words resonated in his chest as he spoke them. "I am not saying it will be easy. 6 years of running does not disappear overnight, but I want to try, if you and she will let me." Vaughn studied him for what felt like an eternity, then nodded slowly. "I will give you my permission on one condition. You must be honest with Beatrice about what you are feeling, all of it. If the restlessness comes, you talk to her about it instead of disappearing into the night. She has lost enough without losing someone else to silence and absence. I give you my word. Then you may court her, with my blessing and my prayers that you both find what you are looking for." Declan left the cottage feeling lighter than he had in years, as if by speaking his grief aloud he had loosened its hold on him. Beatrice was waiting in the garden, ostensibly tending to tomato plants but clearly watching for him. When she saw his expression, her face broke into a radiant smile. He said yes. She laughed and brushed dirt from her hands, and Declan thought he had never seen anything more beautiful than her joy in that moment. "When should we? I mean, what do we do now?" "Now," Declan said. "I take you for a walk properly, where everyone can see that I am courting you. And then perhaps tomorrow we could have a picnic by the river if you are free." "I am free," she said, and the double meaning in those words, the declaration of availability and liberation both, made his heart soar. The next weeks unfolded like a dream Declan had not dared to have. He courted Beatrice with all the careful attention his rough cowboy manners would allow, bringing her wildflowers he picked before dawn shifts at the mill, meeting her after school to walk her home, attending every church service and social event. Centralia watched their courtship with interest, the drifting cowboy and the educated city woman, an unlikely pair that somehow seemed to fit. They talked endlessly, sharing histories and hopes, fears and foolish dreams. Beatrice spoke of wanting to make a real difference in her students' lives, of believing that education could be a great equalizer in this rough territory. Declan found himself sharing dreams he had buried after the fire, of wanting land again someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses, nothing grand but something his own. "You should do it," Beatrice said one Sunday afternoon as they sat by the Skookumchuck River, watching the water flow past. "There is land available around Centralia. You could file a homestead claim. That takes money I do not have and years of proving the claim. I am barely scraping together boarding house fees. Then save, work toward it, or am I not reason enough to put down roots?" She said it lightly, but he heard the real question underneath. Declan took her hand, marveling at how small it felt in his work-roughened palm. "You are reason enough for anything. I just do not want you to think I am courting you for some kind of stability or convenience. You are not a means to an end, Beatrice. You are the point of everything." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "I love you," she said, the words simple and devastating. "I probably should not say it so plainly, should make you work harder to hear it, but I am tired of pretending to be something I am not. I love you, Declan Irwin, even though you are completely wrong for me on paper. Maybe especially because of that." "I love you too," he said, and felt something in his chest that had been locked tight since the fire finally, blessedly open. I have loved you since that first Wednesday supper when you looked at me like I was a person worth knowing, not just another rough mill worker. I love you for your strength and your vulnerability, your certainty and your doubts. I love all of you. He kissed her then, softly, reverently, there by the river with the sun warm on their faces and the sound of water providing a gentle soundtrack. It was not his first kiss, but it felt like it. Felt like every other kiss had been practiced for this moment, this woman, this feeling of rightness that suffused everything. When they finally pulled apart, Beatrice was smiling through tears. So what do we do now? Now I work and save. I prove I can stay in one place, build a life. And when I have something to offer you beyond a drifter's uncertain future, I ask you to marry me. What if I do not want to wait that long? The question surprised him. What are you saying? I am saying that I did not survive losing my parents and crossing the continent to start over just to be cautious now. I am saying that if you love me and I love you, then perhaps we should simply move forward with our lives instead of waiting for some perfect moment that may never come. She squeezed his hand. Ask me to marry you, Declan. Beatrice, I have almost nothing to my name. I live in a boarding house and work at a mill. I cannot give you the life you had in Boston. I do not want the life I had in Boston. I want a life with you, whatever that looks like. We will figure out the rest together. He looked at her sitting there in her simple dress, her hair coming loose from its pins, her eyes fierce with determination and love. He thought of all the places he had drifted through, all the empty mornings waking in strange towns. He thought of his family's ranch burning, of losses he could not prevent. And then he thought of staying, of building something new with this remarkable woman, of finally letting himself have hope. Beatrice Vaughn, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you marry me? Yes, she said immediately. Yes, absolutely yes. They married in August on a warm Sunday afternoon with the whole town in attendance. Beatrice wore a simple white dress. She had sewn herself with help from some of the other women in town. And Declan wore new clothes purchased with his carefully saved wages. Reverend Vaughn performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, giving away his niece to a man who had proven his worth not through wealth or status, but through steady devotion and genuine character. Mrs. Calloway had offered them the best room at the boarding house at a reduced rate as a wedding gift, and Declan had accepted gratefully. It was not much, but it was clean and private, and for now it was enough. They would save together now, plan together, build their future one careful step at a time. Their wedding night was tender and slightly awkward. Two people learning each other in the most intimate way. But there was laughter mixed with the passion, honest communication that made the awkwardness dissolve into connection. Afterward, lying in the narrow bed with Beatrice curled against his side, Declan felt peace settle over him for the first time in 6 years. No regrets, he asked, stroking her hair. None whatsoever. You. Only that I did not ride into Centralia sooner. She laughed and tilted her face up to kiss him. You arrived exactly when you were supposed to. I was not ready for you before this. Over the following months, they built their life together with determination and joy. Beatrice continued teaching, and Declan took on extra shifts at the mill whenever possible, every spare coin going into their savings jar. They attended church faithfully, shared meals with Reverend Vaughn weekly, became fixtures in the community. Declan found that the restlessness he had carried for so long was fading, replaced by something more solid. There were still moments, usually in the hour before dawn, when the old urge to saddle up and ride would whisper through him. But then Beatrice would stir beside him, Or he would remember that she was teaching the older students Shakespeare that week and wanted to discuss it with him, and the urge would fade. He was learning what Reverend Vaughn had tried to tell him that first night, that healing happened in stillness, in the daily choice to stay and build rather than run and hide. His grief over his lost family was still there, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet ache rather than a raw wound. He found he could think of his father and brother without the crushing guilt, could remember his mother's last smile without feeling like he was drowning. In October, Beatrice came to him with news that made his heart nearly stop. "I am with child," she said, her voice a mixture of joy and nervousness. "I know we had talked about waiting until we had the homestead, but nature apparently had other ideas." Declan pulled her into his arms, emotion overwhelming him. "This is wonderful, terrifying but wonderful. You are not upset about the timing. How could I be upset about this? You are giving me a family again." He kissed her soundly. "We will figure it out, just like we figure everything else out." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Beatrice had to stop teaching in January when her condition became too obvious, and Declan worried about their reduced income. But the community rallied around them in ways that left him humbled. Mrs. Calloway reduced their rent further. Other mill workers shared hunting bounties. The church collected a basket of baby clothes and necessities. "This is what community means," Beatrice said one evening as she sorted through the donated items. "People caring for each other, helping each other through difficult times. This is why I stayed in Centralia, even though it is so different from Boston. Here, people matter more than appearances." In March, as the Washington Territory began its slow emergence from winter into spring, Beatrice went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Declan spent hours pacing the hallway outside their room while the midwife and Mrs. Calloway attended to his wife. Every cry of pain that made it through the door was like a knife to his heart, reminding him that love meant vulnerability, that caring deeply meant risking devastating loss. But when the baby's cry finally cut through the air, strong and healthy, he felt only overwhelming gratitude. The midwife emerged with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Irwin. Both mother and baby are doing well." Declan entered the room to find Beatrice propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle. When she looked up at him, her smile was transcendent. "Come meet your son." He crossed the room on shaking legs and looked down at the baby in her arms. His son had a shock of dark hair and a tiny scrunched face, and Declan felt his heart expand in ways he had not known possible. "He is perfect," he whispered. "We should name him after your father," Beatrice said softly. "Daniel, if that is acceptable to you." Declan had to turn away for a moment, overcome. His father's name had been Daniel Irwin, and hearing it spoken in connection with this new life felt like a benediction, like the past blessing the future. "Yes," he managed. "Daniel Irwin, it is perfect." Fatherhood transformed Declan in ways both expected and surprising. The bone-deep exhaustion from split nights and a crying infant, combined with long days at the mill, pushed him to his limits. But watching his son grow and change daily, seeing Beatrice transform into a fiercely devoted mother, filled him with purpose beyond anything work had ever provided. Daniel was 3 months old when Gunderson called Declan into his office at the mill. "Sit down, Irwin. I have a proposition for you." Declan sat, wary. Unexpected meetings with the boss rarely meant good things. "You have been here over a year now," Gunderson continued. "You are one of my most reliable workers, never late, never drunk on the job, and you have a good head for logistics. I need a mill foreman for the night shift, someone who can manage crews and keep production moving smoothly. The pay is better, and the hours would let you see your family more during daylight. Interested?" Yes, sir. Very interested. Good. You start next week, and Irwin. I am glad you decided to stay in Centralia. We need men like you. The promotion meant more money for their savings, a faster path to the homestead claim Declan still dreamed of. He told Beatrice that evening, and she cried with relief and joy. "We are actually going to make it," she said. "We are going to build the life we want." "We already are," Declan said, gesturing to their small room to Daniel sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "This is the life I want right here. Everything else is just details." But the details mattered, and they worked toward them with steady determination. By the time Daniel was walking, they had saved enough for a down payment on a small piece of land outside of town. It was not much, just 20 acres of partially cleared timber land with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. Declan filed the homestead claim in September of 1886, 2 years after riding into Centralia with nothing but a horse and dwindling hope. They spent weekends on the land, Declan clearing timber with help from some of the mill workers, Beatrice planning where the house and garden would go. Daniel toddled around under his mother's watchful eye, discovering pine cones and beetles with the solemn wonder of toddlerhood. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is real," Beatrice said one Sunday afternoon as they rested in the shade. "2 years ago I was alone in Boston, planning to come west with no idea what I would find. And now I have you and Daniel and this land, and a future I actually want to live in." "Do you miss Boston at all?" Declan asked. "The culture, the sophistication," she considered the question seriously. "I miss certain things. Good bookstores, mostly. Music halls. But I do not miss the person I was there, always trying to fit into boxes that were too small for me. Here I can breathe. Here I can be myself and not apologize for it." "Good," Declan said. "Because I like who you are, and I would hate for you to have to change her for anyone." They built a small cabin on the land that fall, working every spare hour. It was rough and drafty, far from the fine houses of Beatrice's Boston childhood, but it was theirs. They moved out of the boarding house in November, and Declan felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that had eluded him for so long. The first night in their own home, they lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines and Daniel's soft breathing from his small cot in the corner. "I am home," Declan said quietly. "For the first time since the fire, I am actually home." Beatrice laced her fingers through his. "We both are." The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The homestead demanded constant work, the mill required long hours, and children were expensive in both time and money. But Declan and Beatrice faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each shared hardship and triumph. When Daniel was 3, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara after Beatrice's mother. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes, and she ruled the household with the imperious confidence of a born leader. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas, who was quiet and thoughtful, content to watch the world with solemn attention. The homestead grew slowly but steadily. Declan built a barn and purchased 3 horses, the beginning of the breeding operation he had always dreamed of. Beatrice created a garden that fed them through winter, preserved in jars lining the shelves Declan built for that purpose. They acquired chickens, a milk cow, and eventually a pair of pigs. Centralia grew too, transforming from a rough timber town into a proper community with multiple churches, a real school building where Beatrice returned to teaching part-time once Thomas was old enough, and even a small library. The territory was changing, becoming more settled, more civilized, and Declan found he did not mind. He had had enough of rough living and uncertainty. Reverend Vaughn grew older but remained active in the church. delighting in his great nieces and nephews, for Declan and Beatrice provided him with 7 grandchildren over the years. Sunday dinners at the homestead became a tradition, the old reverend holding court at the head of the table, while children clamored for his attention and his stories. "You did well for yourself," Vaughn told Declan one evening after the children had been put to bed and they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Better than I dared hope when you first walked into that church supper, a drifter looking for free food." "I did not do it alone," Declan said. "Beatrice saved me as much as I saved her, maybe more. That is what love is supposed to do, save us from our smaller selves, make us capable of more than we thought possible." The Reverend puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. "You still feel it sometimes, the wanderlust?" Declan considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, in the small hours. A whisper of what it was like when I could just saddle up and ride, when I had no responsibilities beyond my own survival. But it is like remembering a fever dream, something that belonged to a different person. The man I am now cannot imagine leaving, would not want to even if I could." "Good. Because that woman in there, those children, they need you. Not just your physical presence, but all of you settled and committed and present." "They have me," Declan said firmly. "They have always had me, from the moment I saw Beatrice in that church. I just did not know it yet." Vaughn smiled. "I knew it, saw it in how you looked at her, even that first night. That is why I gave you permission to court her despite your lack of prospects. Some things you just know, deep in your bones." The Reverend died peacefully in his sleep 2 winters later, surrounded by family, his life's work complete. They buried him beside the church he had served for 30 years, and Declan felt the loss keenly. Vaughn had been more than an uncle by marriage. He had been a father figure, a guide, a friend when Declan needed one most. "He loved you," Beatrice said as they stood at the grave after the funeral. "He told me once that you were the answer to prayers he had been praying since I arrived, that you were exactly the man I needed, even if neither of us knew it at first. I am going to miss him." "Me too. But look at what he left behind." She gestured to their children clustered around them, to the community gathered to mourn a good man. "This is his legacy, all these lives he touched and changed, including ours." Time moved forward as it always does, measured in seasons and harvests, in children growing and changing, in the slow accumulation of shared history. Daniel grew into a serious young man who loved the horses as much as his father did and took over more of the ranch work, as Declan's body began to show the wear of hard living. Clara became a teacher like her mother, fierce and passionate about education. Thomas studied law and left for Seattle, though he visited often. The other children, 4 more spanning 12 years, each found their own paths. Some stayed in Centralia, others ventured out into a world that was rapidly modernizing. But they all came home for holidays and important occasions, filling the homestead with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a large, loving family. Declan and Beatrice grew old together, their love deepening into something comfortable and enduring, passion transforming into profound partnership. They still took walks together when weather and health permitted, still held hands across the dinner table, still found reasons to laugh together. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Daniel and the other children arranged a celebration at the homestead, inviting what felt like the entire town. As Declan stood on his porch watching the gathering, Beatrice at his side, he marveled at the impossible journey that had brought him here. "What are you thinking?" Beatrice asked, reading his expression with the ease of 3 decades together. "I am thinking about that gunshot I heard riding into Centralia 31 years ago, how close I came to just passing through like I had passed through so many other towns. I am thinking about how my entire life pivoted on the decision to stay for one church supper, to walk down one alley at the right moment, to let myself hope when hope seemed foolish. You have regrets. Not a single one. You were worth settling down for, Beatrice. Worth every moment of struggle and doubt. I would do it all again without hesitation. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, silver hair catching the late afternoon sun. I love you, Declan Irwin. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for whatever years remain. I love you too, he said, and kissed the top of her head, surrounded by the noise of their children and grandchildren, standing on land they had claimed and made their own, living a life he had once thought impossible. The wandering cowboy had finally found his home, and it had been worth every mile of the journey to get there. They lived many more good years together, Declan and Beatrice, watching their family expand to include grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The homestead remained in the family, passed down to Daniel, who ran it with his father's care and his mother's practical wisdom. The horses Declan had bred became known throughout Washington for their quality and temperament, a legacy that would outlive him. Beatrice continued teaching into her 60s, beloved by generations of students who remembered her as both demanding and kind. She never lost her love of poetry or her fierce belief that education could change lives. The library in Centralia eventually bore her name, a testament to her decades of advocacy for literacy and learning in the community. Declan was 74 when his heart finally began to fail, his body worn out from a lifetime of hard work. He faced death as he had faced life in those final years, with calm acceptance and gratitude for the time he had been given. Surrounded by children and grandchildren in the house he had built with his own hands, Beatrice holding his hand as she had held it for nearly 50 years, he closed his eyes for the last time. At his funeral, the church overflowed with people whose lives he had touched in ways large and small. Daniel gave the eulogy, speaking of a father who had taught him the value of hard work and integrity, who had shown him that a man's worth was measured not in wealth or status, but in how he treated others and the legacy he left behind. But it was Beatrice who had the final word, speaking briefly at the graveside as they laid him to rest on a hill overlooking the homestead he had built. My husband was a wanderer who learned to stay, a drifter who became the most steadfast man I ever knew. He taught me that love is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day, doing the work, choosing each other through all the seasons of life. I am grateful beyond words for every moment we shared, and I will carry him in my heart until we meet again. Beatrice lived 5 more years, increasingly frail but mentally sharp until the end. She spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories of the early days in Centralia, of a handsome cowboy who had ridden into town with nothing but dust on his boots and hope in his heart. She spoke of their courtship and early marriage with such vividness that her grandchildren felt they had been there, witnessing the love story unfold. When she died peacefully in her sleep at 79, they buried her beside Declan on that hill, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their long, full lives. Between the 2 stones, their children planted a sapling oak, which grew over the years into a magnificent tree, its roots intertwining in the earth just as their lives had intertwined in marriage. The homestead remained in the family for generations, each inheritor hearing the story of how it all began, of a wandering cowboy and a preacher's niece who found each other against all odds in a rough timber town in Washington Territory. The story became part of family lore, told and retold, embellished and refined, but always maintaining its essential truth, that love can anchor a drifting soul, that the right person can make anywhere home, that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop running and let himself be found. Years became decades, decades became a century, and still the descendants of Declan and Beatrice Irwin gathered at the homestead for holidays and reunions, walking the land their ancestors had claimed and cultivated, visiting the graves on the hill where two people who had changed each other's lives lay resting in the earth they had made their own. The old church where they had married still stood in Centralia, though much renovated over the years. The schoolhouse where Beatrice had taught was now a historical museum. The lumber mill where Declan had worked had long since closed, the timber economy giving way to other industries. But the love story endured, passed down through generations, a reminder that in even the roughest times and hardest places, love could take root and flourish. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the oak tree on the hill, locals swore they could hear something like laughter carried on the breeze, the sound of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built from nothing something that would last far beyond their mortal years, whose love had proven strong enough to transform not just their own lives, but those of everyone they touched. In the end, that was the true measure of their story, not the hardships they overcame or the challenges they faced, but the love they created and nurtured, the family they built, the community they served, and the legacy they left behind. A wandering cowboy and a preacher's niece, two unlikely people in an unlikely place, who proved that with love, commitment, and faith, anything was possible. Their story was told in Centralia for generations, a local legend that inspired other young lovers facing obstacles and doubts. When times were hard, people remembered Declan arriving with nothing but a horse and finding everything that mattered. When love seemed uncertain, they recalled Beatrice taking a chance on a drifter because her heart told her he was worth the risk. The homestead stood for over 120 years before finally being donated to the Washington State Historical Society, preserved as an example of early homestead life in the Pacific Northwest. Visitors walked through the small cabin where Daniel had been born, saw the barn Declan built with his own hands, explored the gardens Beatrice had planted and tended. They read the letters and diaries preserved there, intimate glimpses into a love that had been both ordinary and extraordinary. In one letter, written to her cousin in Boston 10 years into her marriage, Beatrice had captured the essence of what she and Declan had built. "You ask if I am happy in my rough frontier life, so far from the comforts and culture we knew. I tell you honestly that I have never been happier. We have little in the way of material wealth, but we are rich in all the ways that matter. My husband works hard and loves deeply. My children are healthy and curious, and I wake each morning with purpose and peace. I chose to take a chance on love when logic might have dictated otherwise, and I have been rewarded beyond measure. If you learn nothing else from my experience, dear cousin, learn this. A good heart and honest love are worth more than all the society connections and fine houses in the world." That letter, displayed under glass in the museum, brought tears to the eyes of countless visitors who recognized in Beatrice's words their own hopes and dreams, who saw in her story a reflection of their own struggles to build meaningful lives in difficult times. The oak tree on the hill became a local landmark, visible for miles around, its massive trunk and spreading branches a living monument to enduring love. Couples in Centralia began a tradition of visiting the tree on their wedding days, touching its bark and silently asking for blessings on their own unions. Some carved initials into a special section of fence placed nearby for that purpose. Others simply stood in its shade and felt the peace of that place, the sense that something holy had happened there. Daniel Irwin, who lived to be 87, often visited his parents' graves in his final years. His own children would drive him up the hill, help him from the car, and watch as he stood beneath the tree his siblings had planted so long ago. Sometimes he spoke to his parents, updating them on family news, asking for guidance with decisions, simply maintaining the connection that death had interrupted but not severed. Once, near the end of his own life, his granddaughter asked him what he remembered most about his father. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. "His steadiness," he said finally. "My father was the most steady man I ever knew. He had been a drifter in his youth, always moving, but once he decided to stay, he was immovable. He showed up every day, did the work, loved my mother and us children with complete commitment. In a changing world, he was our constant, our anchor. That is what I try to be for my own family, what he taught me a man should be." That steadiness, that commitment to showing up and doing the work of love day after day, became the real inheritance Declan and Beatrice left their descendants. Not land or money, though those had value, but the example of how to build a life that mattered, how to love in the practical, daily ways that sustained relationships through decades. Their youngest child, Margaret, who lived to be 93, wrote a memoir late in life that became a regional bestseller. In it, she devoted chapters to her parents' love story, drawing on family letters, interviews with older siblings, and her own memories. She wrote of Sunday dinners filled with laughter, of her father teaching each child to ride, of her mother's fierce defense of education and opportunity for all her children, regardless of gender. But what resonated most with readers was Margaret's description of the small intimacies that characterized her parents' relationship. How her father still opened doors for her mother after 40 years of marriage, how they still held hands when they walked, how they had a private joke about church suppers that would make them both laugh no matter how many times it was referenced. These details made the love story real, transformed it from legend into lived experience that others could aspire to emulate. The final chapter of Margaret's memoir was titled "What They Taught Me," and in it, she distilled the lessons learned from watching a great love endure across a lifetime. "Love was a choice made daily," she wrote, "not a feeling that sustained itself without effort. It required communication, compromise, and the willingness to grow together rather than apart. It meant celebrating successes and weathering failures as a team. It meant choosing to see the best in your partner even when showing their worst. Most importantly, it meant showing up every single day and doing the work." These lessons rippled outward through generations, shaping how the descendants of Declan and Beatrice Irwin approached their own relationships. The family had its share of troubles, as all families do, but there was a foundation there, a template for committed love that helped more marriages succeed than fail. On the 150th anniversary of their wedding, the family held a reunion at the Homestead Museum. Over 200 descendants gathered, ranging from great-great-great-grandchildren to elderly cousins who barely knew each other. They shared stories, compared genealogies, and marveled at the vast family tree that had grown from one cowboy and one teacher who had taken a chance on love in frontier Washington. The eldest attendee, Daniel's daughter Rose, who was 98, stood beneath the oak tree and addressed the crowd. Her voice was thin but clear, as she spoke of visiting this very spot with her grandfather when she was a little girl, of hearing him talk about the love between his parents with such reverence that she understood even then that she was hearing something sacred. "They were not perfect people," Rose said, leaning heavily on her cane. "They had flaws and made mistakes like we all do, but what made them special was not perfection, it was commitment. When things got hard, and they often did in those early years, They did not give up on each other or their life together. They worked through problems instead of running from them. They chose love over pride, partnership over independence, building over leaving. That choice, made over and over across 50 years, is what created all of this. She gestured at the gathered family. Every person here exists because two people in 1884 decided that love was worth the risk, worth the work, worth everything. As the sun set over the homestead that evening, the gathered family shared a meal in the way Declan and Beatrice would have appreciated: simple food and good company. Multiple generations talking and laughing and connecting. Children played in the fields where their ancestors had played. Teenagers explored the barn and cabin with the casual certainty of immortality. Adults compared notes on careers and challenges. Elders shared wisdom and warnings, hoping some of it would be heeded. And through it all, the oak tree stood sentinel on the hill, its leaves rustling in the evening breeze, standing over the graves of two people who had lived ordinary lives in extraordinary ways, who had proven that true legacy is not measured in wealth or fame but in love given and received, in family nurtured and community served, in the choice to build something lasting in an impermanent world. As darkness fell and the reunion wound down, a young couple in their early 20s stood alone beneath the tree, recently engaged and facing uncertainty about their future together. They had come to the reunion to connect with family, but found themselves drawn to this spot, to the tangible symbol of enduring love. "You think we can have what they had?" the young woman asked, looking at the two simple headstones barely visible in the fading light. Her fiancé was quiet for a moment, then squeezed her hand. "I think we can have what we build together, whatever that turns out to be." They did not start with some guarantee or perfect plan. They just decided they were worth the effort and did the work. "We can do that too." She leaned into him, and they stood there in the gathering darkness. Two more people taking a chance on love. Two more souls choosing to believe that commitment and effort could create something beautiful and lasting. In that moment, they carried forward the legacy of Declan and Beatrice Irwin, not consciously or deliberately, but simply by choosing to try. And somewhere beyond understanding if such things are possible, two spirits who had loved deeply and well in their time on earth smiled at the continuation of the story they had begun so long ago in a rough timber town in Washington Territory. When a wandering cowboy decided that a preacher's niece was worth settling down for, and she decided he was worth taking a chance on. Their love story had ended, as all love stories must, with death and separation. But what they had built together, the family and legacy and example they left behind, continued to ripple outward through time, touching lives they would never know, inspiring love in people not yet born when they walked the earth. In the end, that is what made their story worth telling, worth preserving, worth passing down through generations. Not because it was unique or extraordinary in its events, but because it was true, because it showed that ordinary people facing ordinary challenges could create something extraordinary through love, commitment, and the daily choice to show up and do the work of building a life together. The wandering cowboy and the preacher's niece, Declan and Beatrice Irwin, had lived and loved and left the world richer for their presence in it. Their story had a clear ending, but their influence had no conclusion, continuing to inspire and guide long after they were gone. And that, perhaps, is the best any of us can hope for. To love deeply, to build truly, and to leave behind something that makes the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more full of hope. They had done exactly that, two unlikely people in an unlikely place, proving that with love, anything is possible, and that settling down for the right person is not a sacrifice but a privilege, not an ending but a beginning, not a limitation but a liberation into the fullest expression of what life can be. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal in the lives they had touched and the family they had created. And so the wandering cowboy and the preacher's niece lived on, not in flesh but in memory, not in presence but in influence, not in life but in the enduring power of a love story that had proven true across time and circumstance, a beacon of hope for anyone who wondered if settling down was worth the risk. The answer, written in their lives and carried forward through generations, was always yes, always worth it, always enough, always and forever a resounding yes.